Picture this. You're standing right at the edge of an ancient forest. The mist is rolling in thick, wrapping around the gnarled roots of these massive, towering oak trees. For a second, the whole world just feels different, right? Almost like you've stepped into a place where time doesn't exactly move the way it's supposed to. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're cutting straight through that mist to uncover the actual history of the greatest, most enigmatic wizard of all time. I mean, we all know the name. Merlin, the ultimate master of magic, the wise old mentor in the pointy hat who literally shaped the fate of King Arthur. But the truth of his origin? It's much bigger, way older, and honestly, far stranger than you might think.
Take a listen to this. A wild hermit, doomed to wander alone, predicting the fate of Britain but unable to change it. Now that doesn't sound like the sparkling, all-powerful wizard of Camelot, does it? But before the shiny silver armor and the grand stone castles, this was Merlin. And it immediately brings up this chilling question that we've got to ask right from the jump. Was the ultimate architect of Arthur's kingdom a supernatural demon, a highly calculated political mastermind, or just a grieving madman screaming out in the woods? Okay, let's dive into this. Because to figure out who Merlin truly is, we have to look at how he was literally constructed, piece by piece, across the centuries. You see, Merlin doesn't have just one neatly written origin story. The guy is a seriously tangled mix of history, myth, and incredibly wild medieval imagination. We actually kick things off way back in the 6th century with a Welsh figure named Myrddin Wyllt. Then, flash forward to 1136, and a cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth entirely reinvents him for his grand history of Britain. And finally, right around the year 1200, a French poet named Robert de Boron steps in and adds all those Christian magical elements that essentially cement the wizard we all recognize today. So let's start at the very beginning with the ancient Celtic roots of the character. This first guy, Myrddin Wyllt, he absolutely wasn't some courtly magician living in a castle. He was a 6th century Welsh bard, an advisor to a warlord, and according to the absolute earliest Welsh poetry we have, this man witnessed the sheer unimaginable horror and bloodshed of a brutal battle, and it completely broke him. Stricken with intense grief, he literally lost his mind and fled deep into the wild Caledonian forest. He lived out there like a feral druid among the animals, surviving in the dirt, speaking only in these dark, cryptic riddles. People feared him. He was deeply misunderstood and seen as a man cursed with the second sight. Basically, a wild man of the woods who completely embodied the untamed ancient ways of Britain. But then the narrative shifts drastically in the 12th century. This cleric, Geoffrey of Monmouth, takes that feral madman and just completely reinvents him into Merlinus. But here's the kicker. He gives him a genuinely terrifying new origin. Geoffrey takes the Welsh myth and mashes it up with Roman and Christian traditions, making Merlin the literal son of a mortal woman and an incubus. Yeah, a supernatural demon. Because he was half human and half demon, Merlin existed entirely between realms. He wasn't exactly the good guy, but he wasn't pure evil either. He was uniquely guided by these dark, shadowy forces that operated way, way beyond the mortal world. Now, you might be wondering, if this kid was born of a literal demon, why didn't he just destroy the world? Well, the 12th century poet Robert de Boron comes in to provide that exact answer. He wrote that Merlin was, in fact, absolutely destined to be the Antichrist. But right at the last possible second, a holy priest named Blaise intervenes and baptizes the infant Merlin immediately after he's born. And that quick intervention, it severed Satan's hold. It transformed a child meant for ultimate darkness into a benevolent prophet. He got to keep his supernatural knowledge of the past and his demonic power of shapeshifting, but God flipped the script and granted him the incredible ability to see the future. And this brilliantly illustrates the total mind-bending transformation of this character. On one side, you have the early Celtic Merlin, wild, mad, deeply connected to the earthy forest, literally surviving on berries. But then on the other side, you have the medieval romance Merlin. This version is courtly, insanely powerful, a literal kingmaker, and the architect of British destiny. He evolved from a broken man, shattered by the reality of human war, into this deliberate, highly composed scholar who could pull the strings and manipulate the very fabric of kingship. And actually, before we even step foot into Camelot, we have to talk about his very first massive magical feat. King Ambrosius wanted to build this epic monument for fallen British leaders. So he tries to steal an existing megalith from Ireland known as the Giant's Dance. When the king's men completely fail to move it, Merlin steps up. Using his vast knowledge and magic, he literally levitates these massive, impossibly heavy stones across the sea, dropping them down to create what we know today as Stonehenge. For Merlin, knowledge itself was his ultimate magic. So, moving into the Camelot era, we see that Merlin wasn't just some political advisor hanging around Arthur's court. He was the literal architect of the king's entire existence. He orchestrated this massive three-step master plan to forge the ultimate kingdom from scratch. He absolutely didn't wait around for destiny to just happen. He manufactured it himself. Let's quickly break down these three incredibly manipulative, calculated steps that totally changed the course of British history. Step 1. The deception at Tintagel. So High King Uther Pendragon becomes dangerously obsessed with Aegirna, who happens to be the wife of his bitter rival, the Duke of Cornwall. Uther begs Merlin for help, and Merlin, knowing that this specific union was absolutely necessary to conceive Arthur, agrees, but he uses some incredibly questionable trickery to get it done. He casts an illusion, transforming Uther to look exactly like the Duke. Uther just walks right into this impenetrable, stormy cliffside castle completely undetected and sleeps with Aegirna. Look, Merlin was a pragmatist above all else. He served the grand design of fate, definitely not the moral rules of men. Then we get to step 2, and honestly, this might have been his most brilliant strategic move. Merlin knew Uther's court was just a toxic mess of corruption and power-hungry lords, so the very moment Arthur is born, Merlin demands the child as payment for his illusion spell. He takes the infant, slips away, and hides him in a quiet, rustic home with a minor noble named Sir Ector. Arthur was raised in total secrecy by a warm firelight, completely unaware that he had royal blood in his veins. By completely removing Arthur from the treacherous, cutthroat politics of the court, Merlin virtually guaranteed that the future king would grow honorable, humble, and completely untouched by greed. Which brings us to step 3. When Uther eventually dies, Britain predictably falls into absolute chaos. Nobody had any idea there was a true, legitimate heir out there. So Merlin manufactures this miraculous, dramatic test. He places a sword and an anvil in a churchyard with that famous inscription we all know. Every great warlord in the country tries to pull it out, and every single one of them fails. But young Arthur, who is literally just looking for a quick replacement sword for his foster brother, pulls it out effortlessly. Merlin totally fabricated this highly theatrical divine moment to reveal Arthur's destiny. He needed the common people to accept the boy as the absolute will of heaven, basically trying to stop a massive civil war before it started. But as you can imagine, preventing war entirely, that was impossible. The moment Arthur was actually crowned, he faced this immediate, incredibly violent backlash. 6 powerful rebellious kings, including King Lot, flat out refused to bow down to some unknown teenager from nowhere. They launched a brutal 15-day siege on the city of Caerleon, soaking the battlefield in mud and blood. And when Merlin actually rode out to try and peacefully explain Arthur's true royal lineage, King Lot literally laughed right in his face. He openly mocked the greatest wizard of the age, dismissing him as nothing more than a glorified dream reader. And wow, was that a colossal mistake. Because Merlin was so much more than a dream reader. Out on that battlefield, Merlin was essentially a terrifying tactical weapon. When the real fighting broke out, he didn't just hide away in a tower reading scrolls. He rode into the thick of it, wielding raw, elemental magic. He cast massive illusions, hurled real fire, and threw walls of thick, pitchy smoke directly into the enemy lines. He completely shattered their formations, blinding and terrifying them. He personally guided Arthur through 12 historic, blood-soaked battles, using his absolute control over perception and nature to violently protect this young king and his fragile new world order. So once the kingdom was actually somewhat secure, Merlin transitioned into acting as Arthur's bridge to the ancient, deeply magical world. In the later texts, the original Sword in the Stone actually breaks in combat, so Merlin personally guides Arthur out to retrieve his true ultimate weapon. Imagine it, a glowing arm clothed in white samite suddenly thrusts up from the incredibly still, glassy water. The Lady of the Lake hands over Excalibur. Merlin's magic at this point isn't just about throwing fireballs. It's about his deep, binding connections to these ancient, otherworldly forces that actually allow Camelot to thrive. But here is the real tragedy of Merlin. Despite all of this incredible, world-bending power, he was profoundly agonizingly lonely. Because he could see the future, he literally couldn't form normal human attachments. He already knew exactly how every single relationship was going to end before it even started. Yet that deep loneliness eventually pushed him to make some incredibly dangerous decisions. Looking for connection, he took on apprentices, specifically Arthur's highly ambitious sister, Morgan Le Fay, and the Lady of the Lake herself, Vivienne. Sitting in his shadowy, scroll-filled chambers, he started teaching them his most deeply guarded, ancient magical secrets.
So the crucial point is that we are left staring at this incredibly tragic paradox. Think about it. He was a being with infinite foresight, the literal master of time, the orchestrator of destiny, the guy who effortlessly moved Stonehenge and engineered the birth of Camelot. And yet, he harbored this entirely inescapable human flaw. Despite knowing everything that was going to happen, he fell hopelessly, desperately in love with Vivienne. She wanted his power, and she carefully, methodically pried his secrets from him, one by one. He was a literal force of nature, yet he was utterly, completely blinded by his own desire. And once Vivienne had finally learned all she needed, she turned his own magic right back against him. She sealed the greatest sorcerer of the age inside an invisible, unbreakable magical barrier. Sometimes it's described as a hollowed-out ancient tree, sometimes a dark cave. But you know what the real killing tragedy here is? It isn't just that he was betrayed. It's that, with his prophetic visions, he almost certainly saw it coming. He either couldn't stop his own downfall because fate is simply unbreakable, or maybe just incredibly wary of the world he consciously chose not to fight it.
In the end, Merlin just faded from the world, leaving Arthur behind to face the coming darkness entirely alone. He shaped kings, he manipulated the timeline of history, and he wielded the very elements themselves. Yet his epic story ends in absolute silence, permanently trapped by his own heart. Merlin built a legend that has survived for over 1,000 years, but ultimately, he was just a prisoner to his own destiny. It leaves you wondering, if the greatest seer in human history couldn't escape his fate, can any of us?